Hello, my name's Andrew Perkins, and welcome to Learning Ajax. Throughout this course, I'll teach you how to create a simple Ajax script, which we can use to issue Ajax requests and process different server responses with. We'll then take our simple Ajax script and turn it into a flexible and easy-to-use Ajax library. Along the way, we'll learn how to cope with a few of the issues you may run into while creating your own Ajax library, such as dealing with GET request caching, providing user feedback, and adding older IE compatibility. Finally, we'll take our complete Ajax library and use it to build a small Ajax search app using the Laravel PHP framework. Now, there are a couple of prerequisites in order to follow along with this course. First of all, I recommend using a newer standards-based browser like Firefox or Chrome, as we won't be accommodating Internet Explorer or older versions like IE6 until later in the course. Additionally, you should already have a good handle on the JavaScript language, such as using anonymous functions, objects, how to work with arrays, loops, control structures, and working with the DOM. Lastly, you'll need at least some fundamental knowledge of how to create HTML, XML, and JSON files, and at least the basics of how to work with a server-side programming language. For this course, I'll be using PHP, but you should be able to adapt the code to work with whatever language you prefer. If you need a refresher on any of these topics before starting this course, you can find lots of other great courses here on Tuts Plus Premium to get you started. Alright, so we're ready to begin building our very own Ajax library. I'll see you in the next lesson. Let's start this course off by writing a very simple Ajax script. This will allow us to see what kind of code is required to do the most basic of Ajax requests. And as we proceed through the course, we'll improve upon our Ajax script by slowly building up a small Ajax toolkit. For this lesson though, we'll keep it nice and simple, but even though it'll be simple, we still have a lot of code to cover. So let's get started. I'll start by creating a new folder inside of my sites directory to hold all of the files that we'll be working with throughout this course. So I'm just going to do this from within my terminal. So I just change directories into my sites directory, and I'll make a new directory named Ajax. Then I'll just change directories into that Ajax folder. And now inside of here, we need to create a couple of folders. We need a JS folder to hold our JavaScript files, and we also need a files folder to hold the text, XML, and HTML snippet files that we'll be loading in with Ajax. So I'm going to create another folder named JS, and I'll create another one named Files. Now I'm just going to open up this Ajax folder into Sublime. There we go. Here's our Ajax folder, and we have our Files and JS folder inside of it. So inside of our Ajax folder, let's create a new file. I'll save this as index.html, and this will be our main HTML file to work with. So I'm just going to put some basic HTML code in here. I'll give this a title of Learning Ajax, and down here inside of the body, let's give this an H1 heading. This will also say Learning Ajax. Then I'll create a link, and we'll use this link to load in a simple text file, updating the page with its contents using Ajax. So this text file will go into our files folder, and I'll name it ajax.txt. We'll create this file in just a minute. So the linked text is going to say load Ajax text file, then we'll close the link. And down here in my script tag, I'm going to load in our main JavaScript file. So this will be under the JS folder, and I'll name it main.js. So that's it for our index.html file. Let's now create these two other files that we need. So under the files folder, I'll create a new file. We'll save this as ajax.txt. And I'm just going to put in some text here that says, your Ajax request was successful if this was loaded in without a full page refresh. And that's it for our text file. We can save this and close it out. Now we need to create our main.js file. So in the JS folder, let's create a new file. We'll save this as main.js. And now we're ready to begin writing our JavaScript. So the first thing we want to do in here is to make sure that we stay out of the global scope so that our script can play nicely with others. We can do this by wrapping any code that we want to write or execute within a self-invoking anonymous function. So we can create a self-invoking anonymous function like this. We start with a set of opening and closing parentheses, and this will return whatever we put in here to our script. Now inside of our parentheses, we write our anonymous function, which is just a function with no name. And then outside of our parentheses, we invoke it using another set of opening and closing parentheses. And we just end with a semicolon. So now whatever we put inside of here will be unique to only this self-invoking anonymous function. It won't interfere with anything outside of it. So now we can safely create new variables and new functions, and we don't have to worry about our code overriding another variable or function from another script or whatever else may be in the global scope. So to prove this to you, in the global scope that's outside of our self-invoking anonymous function at the top of our file, let's create a variable named message, and we'll give this a value of hello. Now back inside of our self-invoking anonymous function, let's create a variable named message in here as well, and we'll give this a different value of goodbye. Now outside and after our self-invoking anonymous function, let's alert the value of our message variable. And now since our self-invoking anonymous function shouldn't interfere with anything that's out in the global scope, our message variable, when it's alerted, should still have the value of hello. It should not be goodbye. So let's test this out. We'll save our file. Let's go into our browser. I'm just going to use Firefox. We can go to our web page, localhost, Ajax, index.html. And there we go. Our alert pops up. And as you can see, it does indeed still say hello. So when we recreated the message variable inside of our self-invoking anonymous function, it had no effect on the global scope's message variable, just like we wanted. Perfect. So we can just hit OK. And now let's take a look at our link here. So if we click on it, the page refreshes and it takes us to our Ajax text file, which is not what we want to happen. Instead, what we want to be able to do is when we click on this link, it should do an Ajax request to load in the text file and update this page with that file's contents without having the page refresh. So we first need to handle the click event of this link. When it's clicked on, we want to fire off an Ajax request. So let's go back into our text editor, and here inside of our main.js file, let's get rid of this alert, and we'll also get rid of our message variables as we won't be using those anymore. And now inside of our self-invoking anonymous function, let's get a reference to our link element here on our page. I'll create a variable named link, and we'll use document.getElements by tag name to grab all of the links on the page, but we only have one, so we just need the first one at index 0. And now we just need to handle the click event of this link. So I'm just going to use DOM level 0 events to do this, as it's an easy cross-browser way to handle this simple event. So we just use link.onClick, and we just assign it a function, end with a semicolon here. And now inside of our onClick event handler at the bottom, we need to make sure to return false in order to disable the default behavior of our link so that it doesn't follow through and display our Ajax text file. Remember, when the link is clicked, we want Ajax to handle displaying the content of our file, not to just go to the file itself. And returning false disables the link's normal behavior. So now when our link is clicked on, we just need to fire off an Ajax request. To do that, we need to create an XML HTTP request object, which will allow us to issue requests to our server asynchronously, meaning when our link's clicked on, our web page doesn't have to do a full refresh to send requests to the server or receive a response back. In this case, our request is going to retrieve the contents of our Ajax text file, and we can then update the page accordingly with that content. So let's create our new XML HTTP request object by storing it in a variable named XHR, just short for XML HTTP request. To create the object, we use new, and we call the XML HTTP request constructor. Make sure you follow the spelling there, as it is case sensitive, and that's all there is to creating an XHR object. So now that we have our object, we can start using it to fire off an Ajax request. So there's 4 main steps that we have to complete in order to perform our Ajax request. The first is to create our XHR object, which we've done here. So let's put a comment here saying XHR object. Then we need to listen for and handle an onReadyState change event, which is triggered by our server. So we'll put another comment here saying handle the onReadyState change event. Then we need to open the request. We'll put a comment here saying open the request. And then lastly, we just need to send the request to the server. So we'll put another comment here saying send the request. So here's our XHR roadmap, but we're going to work in a sort of roundabout way by starting with opening the request. To open a request, we can use our XHR object and call its open method. Basically, this allows us to open a web page or file from the server via Ajax, just like you normally would by entering in a web page's URL into the address bar of your browser. So this method takes 2 arguments and a few optional arguments as well. The first argument is the type of request that you're going to make, like a GET or POST request. Here we're just retrieving a file from the server, so we'll use a GET request by just passing it in as a string. Now the second argument is the URL to the file or page that you're requesting. You can pass this in as a string as well. So it can be a full path or just a partial path. In this case, I'm just going to pass in a partial path to our Ajax text file. So that's under files/ajax.txt. Now the third and optional argument that we're interested in is whether or not you want this request to be done asynchronously. By default, this third argument is set to true, meaning it'll do an asynchronous request so that the user doesn't have to wait for the browser to refresh and complete that request. Instead, the request happens in the background, and the user is free to use the browser as they please. Now, you don't actually have to pass in this third argument if all you want to do is an asynchronous request, as it does default to true, but I like to be explicit, so I'm just going to pass in the Boolean value of true. So that prepares and opens a GET request to retrieve our Ajax text file asynchronously. Next, we just need to send the request to the server. So we can use our XHR object, and we can call its send method. Now this method accepts one parameter, and that's the data that you'd like to send with the request to the server. For example, on POST requests, you might send in a query string of data for the server to process. But in our case, we're going to be doing a GET request, and we don't need to pass in any data to the server. So instead, we pass in null as the argument. And that's it for opening and sending our Ajax request to the server. Now lastly, we just need to handle this onReadyState change event that our server will trigger after it receives our Ajax request. So whenever we do an Ajax request, our server is going to send us back notifications about our Ajax request's ready state, changing its value each time it sends us an update. Now ready state is a property of our XHR object, and when the server updates that ready state property, it will also fire off an onReadyState change event. Now the ready state property of our XHR object, you can access it by using xhr.readystate with a capital S. This property can be equal to the number values of 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, each one being a different state in which our Ajax request is in. So I'm just going to write some comments here so you can see what each state means. So this is the XHR ready state property values. So if the XHR object's ready state is equal to 0, that means it's uninitialized, basically meaning that the request hasn't been opened yet. If ready state is equal to 1, that means it's loading, meaning the request has been opened. If the ready state is equal to 2, that means it's loaded, which means the request has been sent to the server. Now if the ready state is equal to 3, meaning that it's interactive, that means that the server is in the process of sending us a response back for whatever we requested from the server. And then the last one, if the ready state property is equal to 4, that means it's complete. The request is finished, so we have access to the server's response. So now we know that when the server is processing our Ajax request, it's going to change the ready state property of our XHR object, and each time that happens, we know that an onReadyState change event will be fired. So all we need to do to handle this onReadyState change event is assign a function to it so that we can work with what the server responds back with when the ready state is complete. What the server responds back with is called a response, and this response can be HTML, XML, JSON, or in our case, the server will respond back with the contents of our Ajax text file. So to handle this onReadyStateChange event, we just need to attach a function to it. We can use xhr.onReadyStateChange, and you could attach the handle name of a function. For instance, we might create a function named processRequest, and each time the onReadyStateChange event is fired, it'll call our processRequest function. But to make this even simpler, I'm just going to use an anonymous function. So whenever this event is fired, whatever's inside of our anonymous function will be executed. Now what we want to do inside of our event handler is to process our request by using the server's response. Remember, the response will be the contents of our Ajax text file, and then we'll update the page with that content or the response. But remember, this onReadyStateChange event will be fired multiple times by the server. Each time the server changes the ready state property, it could be any of these values, this event will be fired. So we only want to work with the server's response when the ready state is complete. That's number 4. If you try to work with your response at other times during the ready state, your response might not be ready to be used. So you always want to wait until ready state is at 4, meaning that it's complete. So we can check if our XHR's ready state is complete by using an if statement. We'll check if xhr.readystate equals 4. Now notice how I wrapped this first condition in another set of parentheses. I did this because we actually need to check a second condition, as just checking if the ready state is equal to 4 is not enough to ensure that everything will go smoothly with processing the server's response. We also need to make sure that the status of the request is 200, meaning that the request status is okay. So in addition to the server sending us a response and updating the XHR object's ready state, it'll also set the status of our XHR object. Now this status could be a 404, which you've likely seen on some websites. You get a 404 when the page cannot be found, or it might be a status of 500 when there's a server error. We're only interested in 2 status codes. We want to make sure that our request status is either a 200 for OK, or a 304, meaning not modified, because sometimes the server will return a 304 status when the item on the server that's being requested hasn't been changed since the last request. So after our first condition of checking the ready state, we'll use 2 ampersands to check a second condition, and we want to check if the XHR's status is equal to 200, or if the XHR's status is equal to 304. And then we'll open up our curly brackets here for our if statement. So either a status of 200 or 304 and the ready state being at 4 means that we're ready to start processing the server's response to update our page with our Ajax text file's contents. We can grab our server's response using our XHR object and accessing its response text property. That's with a capital T for text. And this will contain the contents of our Ajax text file. Now we just need to update our web page to display the response. We could go ahead and create a paragraph tag inside of our index.html file and just insert the response into it, but that means we then have HTML that was created specifically for JavaScript use only, and I like to try to avoid doing that. So instead, we're going to create a paragraph using some JavaScript and append it as a child to our HTML's body tag. We'll first grab a reference to our body tag element. Let's create a variable named body, and we can use document.getElements by tag name, and we'll grab all of the body tags. You should only have one, so we just grab the one at index 0. Then we need to create a new paragraph element, so let's create a p variable. We'll use document.createElement, and we'll create a new p tag. And then we need to create a text node to hold the text of our paragraph tag, and this will hold our server's response, which is our Ajax text file's contents. So let's create a new variable. I'll name it ptext for the paragraph text, and we'll use document.createTextNode, and we can just pass in our response text property from our XHR object. Now we just need to append our paragraph text node to our newly created paragraph element. So we can use our new paragraph and call append child and pass in our paragraph text node to it. And then finally, we can use our body and we just need to append the newly created paragraph to our body so that it displays on the page. So we use body.append child and pass in our paragraph to it. And that will insert our response as a paragraph element into our page. So with that, our Ajax script is complete. Let's give it a try. I'm going to switch into my browser, and now I'm just going to refresh the page, but before I click on the link, I'm going to open up Firebug so that I can view the console here, so I can see the Ajax request happening. Now, if you're using a different browser, it likely has a similar feature for you to view the JavaScript console and your requests, so you can use whatever you'd like. Let's now go ahead and click on our Load Ajax text file link. And perfect, you can see that the contents of our Ajax text file have been inserted right into our current page. The browser never refreshed. The request to grab our text file actually happened in the background, asynchronously. If we take a look in Firebug, you can see that we did do a GET request, and the status was 200, meaning that it was okay. And if we open up the request, you can see our response here from the server, which is the contents of our Ajax text file. Now, if we click the HTML tab here and we expand the body, you can see here's our paragraph holding our response that we created and inserted right into the DOM. Now, if anything went wrong, you should get an error here in Firebug or whatever console you're using. It would display here in the console. You want to make sure you have all turned on so that you can see everything. And if you did get an error, there should be a line number or some type of message pointing you to where the error may be. Now, if your browser just took you to the Ajax text file, then you probably forgot to return false at the end of our onClick event handler. Remember, inside of here, at the very bottom, we returned false to disable the default behavior of a link. And I just noticed that I left the extra xhr.response text statement here. We don't need that. It was left in there when I was giving you an example. So I'm just going to delete that out of there. There we go. We'll save the file, and everything should work just like it did before. But that's it for this video. Hopefully you found this helpful in creating your first Ajax script. I'll see you in the next lesson. In the last lesson, we created our first very simple Ajax script, and we used it to asynchronously retrieve a text file from the server and update a web page with that file's contents. But most of the time, what you'll be requesting from the server is not just a plain text file. Usually you're wanting the server to return back HTML, XML, or JSON. So over the next couple of lessons, I'll show you how we can use our current simple Ajax script to handle these different types of server responses. After taking a look at how we can handle these server responses, we'll then move on to improving our Ajax script to make it more modular, easier to use and reuse, and accommodate Internet Explorer. So for this lesson, let's see how we can process HTML responses. Now, usually these HTML responses will contain just a snippet of HTML returned from the server, and you then need to update the page with that new HTML. So that's what I'll be showing you in this lesson. Now, the cool thing about the Ajax code that we've written so far is about 80% of it is completely reusable. We just need to change a few things in order to make it work. So under our JS folder, let's open up our main.js file, and here's our Ajax code from the last lesson. So first of all, we don't want to retrieve a text file. Instead, we want to request an HTML file from the server. So let's update our open method here. Instead of ajax.txt, let's request an ajax.html file. Let's now go ahead and create this ajax.html file. So under Files, create a new one. We'll save this as ajax.html. Now in here, I'm just going to insert a snippet of HTML displaying a list of the Ajax roadmap that we talked about in the last lesson, along with an H2 heading. And there we go. Here's my HTML. You can copy this into your file, or you can use whatever HTML you'd like. But that's it for our ajax.html file. Make sure to save it, and we can close it out. And back here in our main.js file, we now need to just change how we process the response inside of our onReadyStateChange event handler. Now, the difference here is that instead of just having plain text being returned back from the server, we actually have formatted HTML code being returned to us. So we'll go about updating our web page with the HTML just a little bit differently than we did for the plain text. We'll start out just like we did before by grabbing a reference to our body element. So we'll leave this body variable here. And now instead of creating a paragraph tag, we'll create a div tag to hold the returned HTML. So I'm going to change the variable name to be d for div, and we'll change the element that we create to div. Now, since we already have formatted HTML being returned from the server, we don't need to create a text node. Instead, we just need to insert this newly created div into the DOM and then update its inner HTML to use our returned HTML snippet, which is inside of the XHR object's response text property. So we can get rid of the text node and the two calls to the append child methods. Let's first append this div to our body, so we can use our body element called the append child method and append our div to it. Now that the div has been inserted into the DOM, we just need to get a reference to the div that we just created so that we can update its inner HTML. To do that, let's create another variable. I'll name this one div. We'll use document.getElementsByTagName, and we'll grab all of the div elements. We only have one, so we just need the first one at index 0. And now we can use our div element to update its inner HTML to hold our XHR object's response text, which is our HTML snippet that we got from the server. So we can use div.innerHTML, where HTML is in all caps, and then we can use our XHR object and grab its response text. So now when our link is clicked on, we'll fire off our Ajax request. We then create a new div, and we insert it into the DOM, and then we update its inner HTML to hold our XHR object's response text, which will then display our HTML in the browser. Now what would be cool is after we click the link and our HTML is loaded in, if we could somehow make that link disappear from the page, as it's no longer needed. And that's actually really easy to do. So after where we update the div's inner HTML, we can use our body element reference, and we can call its remove child method. And we already have a reference to the link from above. Remember at the top here, we grab the link where we attach the onClick event, and we can just pass that link into the remove child method, and that will remove the link. And that's it for our main.js file. Now the last modification I want to make is to change the linked text of our link in our index.html file. So let's open that up, and you can see it says load Ajax text file. Let's change this to say load Ajax HTML file instead. All right, let's switch into the browser and take a look at our page. We can go to localhost Ajax index.html. And now before I click on the link, I'm just going to open up Firebug so that I can see the JavaScript console. And now let's click on our load Ajax HTML file link. And great, our page updates. You can see that the link has disappeared, and our snippet of HTML is loaded right into the current page. Now, usually how this whole process works is that you'll be interacting with a server-side language such as PHP. You'll send in some data to the server with your Ajax request, the server will process it and send you back a snippet of HTML, and you would then display that on the page. And that's exactly what we did here. We just skipped over the server-side language part is all. Everything else is the same though. Now don't worry, we'll be covering doing Ajax requests with server-side languages like PHP later on in the course. But that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next lesson. In the last lesson, we saw how to process HTML responses. In this lesson, we'll learn how to process XML responses by retrieving an XML file from the server asynchronously and updating the web page to display the XML's data as HTML. So let's switch into our text editor. And let's start by creating an XML file that we can work with. So under Files, I'll create a new file. I'll save this as ajax.xml. And just like I did with the HTML snippet, I'm going to have this use some information from our Ajax roadmap. So I'm just going to paste in some simple XML data here. You can see that we start at the top with our XML declaration. We have a roadmap root element. We then have this heading element of Ajax roadmap. We then have an items element to hold all of the items or all of the steps within the Ajax roadmap. So you can see each step is wrapped in an item tag. And so you can use this same code in your XML file if you'd like, or you can have any data structure that you'd prefer. Whatever you want to use is fine. But that's it for the XML file. I'm just going to save it, and I'll leave it open for now. So let's switch into our main.js file. And let's scroll down here to our open method. And let's change this to retrieve the ajax.xml file instead of the HTML file. Now up here in our onReadyStateChange event handler, we just need to process the returned XML from the server and display it on the web page. Now this process is going to be a little more complicated than what we did for our previous responses, as for each element within the XML file, we need to create an HTML element and insert that into the DOM. So let's start by getting rid of a little bit of our code. Let's get rid of the div and everything after it except the removeChild method call, as we still want to hide that link after our Ajax request is complete. So we're keeping this body variable as we still want the reference to the body element here. Now after the body variable, let's start by grabbing the heading from our XML document. If you remember, we have this heading element here with the text Ajax roadmap, so we want to grab that. So we'll create a new variable named heading, and we can use our XHR object, and since we're dealing with XML, we're going to use a response XML property instead of the response text property in order to grab the returned XML response. Now this XML response can be used just like it's an HTML element. So we can use our DOM methods and properties on it to retrieve the different XML elements. What we want to do here is grab the text from the heading element. So we use xhr.responseXML, and we can call the getElementsByTagName method to grab the heading element. Now there's only one of these in our file, so we just need the one at index 0. And now this statement just grabs the element. It does not grab the actual text that's inside of the element. Remember, the text of an element is actually another node. So we have to access this element's first child and then its node value. And that will grab our heading element's text of Ajax roadmap. Now after our heading variable, we just need to create the HTML heading element and the text node to hold the text. We'll first create a new variable. I'll name it h2. Let's scroll over here. And we'll use document.createElement to create an h2 tag. Then we need to create an h2 text node for it. So I'll create another variable named h2 text. We'll use document.createTextNode. And we just pass in our heading variable, which is the heading text from our XML file. Now we need to append the text node to the h2 heading using h2.appendChild, and we pass in our h2 text to it. And then lastly, for the heading, we need to append the h2 heading to our body element so that it's displayed on the page. So we can use body.appendChild and pass in our h2 element to that. Okay, so that's good for now. Let's just make sure that this is working to ensure that our heading has been extracted and that it's being displayed in the browser. But before we go into the browser, I'm going to open up our index.html page, and I'm just going to change our text here to say load Ajax XML file instead of the HTML file. Let's save our file, and we'll go into the browser. We can go to localhost/Ajax, and here's our page. Before I click on the link, I'm just going to open up Firebug, and now I'll click on our load Ajax XML file, and perfect. You can see that it has grabbed our heading right from our XML file and inserted it into the DOM. All right, let's now continue processing the rest of our XML file to display the roadmap in a list. Let's go back into our text editor, and we'll go into our main.js file. And after where we append the h2 text node to the h2 element, we first need to create an unordered list element to hold our roadmap items. I'll create a new variable named list. We'll use document.createElement, and we'll create an unordered list. Now we need to grab the items element. Remember, if we look in our XML file, we have this items element which contains all of our items. So we need to get a reference to this items element. We'll create a new variable named items. We'll use xhr.responseXML. We can call getElementsByTagName, and we can grab the items tag. Remember, there's only one of them, so we just need the one at index 0. So now this statement only gives us a reference to the items element. That's just the items. we actually want to filter down even further and get all of the individual item elements themselves, not just the items tag. So we can do that by reassigning our items variable to a new value of items.getElementsByTagName, and we'll grab all of the individual item tags. So now our items variable is an array of item elements, and we can use a for loop to loop over each element, grab its node value, which is the element's text. We'll create a list item element and a text node, and then we'll insert that into the DOM to display our Ajax roadmap list. So let's start by creating our for loop. We'll set a variable I equal to 0. Our condition will be while I is less than the length of our items array, and then we'll just increment I. And now inside of the loop, we'll create a variable named item, and we can use our items array, sub I, go to its first child, and grab its node value. So now on each iteration over our items array, it'll grab each item's text value and store it in this item variable. Let's now create a new variable named li to hold our li element. So we'll use document.createElement. We'll create an li tag. Now we need the li text node. So we'll create another variable named li text. We'll use document.createTextNode, and we just pass in our item variable to that. And now we need to append the li text to our li element. So we use li.appendChild and pass in our li text. So that creates the list item element. Now we just need to stick it into our list. So we use list.appendChild and pass in our li to that. So now that our list is populated with all of our items, we just need to append the list to our body so that the list displays on our web page. So down here at the bottom, right after we append the h2 heading, we use body.appendChild and pass in our list to that. And with that, we are finished. Let's switch into the browser, and we'll refresh our page, and we'll click our link, and awesome. We've successfully processed an XML file, turned it into HTML, and updated the page with its contents using Ajax. So that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next lesson. So far, we've seen how to process plain text, HTML, and XML responses from the server. In this lesson, we'll wrap up handling the different responses by learning how to work with JSON responses. Let's switch into our text editor, and let's create a new file. I'm going to save this as ajax.json, and this will be the JSON file that we're going to retrieve from the server. Now inside of here, I'm just going to insert some simple data for our Ajax roadmap. You can see we have a heading property that just says JSON Ajax roadmap, and I just put the word JSON in here so that we can be sure that it's retrieving our JSON file and not the XML from the last lesson. And then I just have this items property or items object with our 4 different items in here, item 1, 2, 3, and 4. And that just holds each step in the roadmap. So let's save our JSON file. You can use this same code, you can just copy it into yours, or you can use whatever JSON data you'd like. Let's now go into our main.js file, and we'll scroll to the bottom here, and let's update our open method to retrieve the ajax.json file instead of the XML file. And up here in our onReadyStateChange event handler, we just need to process our JSON to display it in the browser instead of using the response XML property. And luckily for us, most of the code that we have here will remain the same. We just need to retrieve our JSON response rather than the XML. So let's get started. We're still going to need our body element reference here, so we'll keep that body variable. And let's create a new variable. I'll name this JSON, and this is going to hold the JSON data that'll be returned from the server. So what we assign to it is our XHR objects response text. Now JSON responses are handled a little differently than the other responses. So we've used response XML for our XML data, and we've used response text for plain text and HTML. But when we retrieve our JSON file from the server, what we want to have access to is the JSON data as an object, so that we can grab the heading and items properties so that we can access these items inside of the items object. And if we just use the xhr.responseText property alone, we're only going to end up with plain text. So let me show you what I mean. Right after our JSON variable, let's comment out all of the code below it. So we can do a multi-line comment with a / and an asterisk, and then down here at the bottom, right after the remove child method, we'll put an asterisk and another / to end the comment. And after our JSON variable, let's alert that JSON variable. So we'll save our file, and let's switch into the browser. Let's go to our web page, localhost/Ajax. Here we go. And now we're going to need to update our linked text, as it still says load Ajax XML file, but we'll do that in a bit. And let's bring up Firebug first, and we'll click on our link. And there we go, we get our alert pop up here. And you can see that we're just getting the text from our JSON file, which is not what we want. We want this to be an actual object, so we can reference this heading and items properties in the object. So we need some way to parse this text and to turn it into a JavaScript object. Now in some Ajax tutorials, you'll learn that you can use the eval function to parse your JSON, but this can lead to some security issues. So a safe and popular way of parsing your JSON data is to use Douglas Crockford's json2.js file. This will provide us with a json.parse method that we can use, and we can pass in our response text to it. It'll parse our JSON for us, returning back an object with our JSON data inside of it. So let's hit OK, and we can download Douglas's JSON parser on his GitHub page. And here's Douglas's GitHub page. It's just at github.com/douglascrockford/json-js. Now the file that we're interested in is the json2.js, so let's click on that. And then on the right at the top here, you'll see we have this raw button, so we can click on that. And now we can select all of the code, copy it, we can close this page out, and let's switch into our text editor. And inside of our JS folder, let's create a new file. We'll paste in the code, and let's save this as json2.js. And we can close that out now. And now we just need to link it in on our HTML page. So let's open up index.html. I'm just going to duplicate our script line here, and let's change the top one to link in the json2.js file, and then after it we load in the main.js file. Let's also update our link here, so this should say load Ajax JSON file, and we should have been updating the actual link here as well. As you can see, it's still going to ajax.text, but that's not that big of a deal. We'll change it here now to go to ajax.json, and we can save this file. And let's go back into our main.js now. And then in our JSON variable, we can use json.parse, and we just pass our response text into it. And now our JSON has been parsed, and we have access to our data in this JSON variable. So now let's see what happens when we alert our JSON variable. Let's save our file. We'll go back into the browser. Let's refresh, and we'll click on our link. And now you can see that we have an actual object, and it's not just plain text. All right, so now we're ready to take the data from our JSON object and turn it into HTML elements to update our web page with. Let's go back into our text editor, and let's remove the alert statement, as we don't need to do that anymore. And let's get rid of our multi-line comment here as well. Make sure to get rid of the one at the bottom. And let's start by getting the heading from our JSON data. If you remember, if we look in our JSON file here, you can see we have this heading property. So we can access this heading as a property of our JSON variable, or our JSON object. So here in our heading variable, let's change this. We'll get rid of this code, and we'll use our JSON object and grab its heading. And now when our H2 element and the text node are created, it'll use our JSON heading instead of the XML. So that's it for the heading part of the code. And now for the list of the roadmap steps, we're just going to leave the list variable as it is, as that will create our unordered list element. And we just need to change our items variable to use our JSON items object. Remember, if we look at our JSON here, we have this items object, which contains the 4 steps, or the 4 items. So we can get rid of the items reassignment, and we'll change the value of the items variable to use JSON items. And then for our for loop, where we loop over all of the items to create each item's HTML element, instead of using a regular for loop, we're going to use a for in loop, because this items variable is no longer an array, it's an object. So let's change the for loop to use a for in loop. So we create a variable named key in items. So now the key variable inside of our loop holds the name of the key that it's looping over. For example, let's take a look in our ajax.json file. On the first iteration, that key variable is going to be equal to the item1 key. And then on the second iteration, it'll be equal to item2, and so on. So we can use our items object, and using bracket syntax, we can grab its value using our key variable. So let's do that here, where we assign each item's value to this item variable. Let's change the value to use our items object, and using bracket syntax, we can grab its value just by passing in its key. And now the rest of our code will work as normal. So when the link is clicked on, we fire off our Ajax request to grab our JSON file. We then turn it into a JSON object using json.parse. We grab our heading from the JSON object and turn that into an h2 element. We then create our unordered list. We grab all of the items from our JSON data. We loop over them, and we create a list item element for each one. And then finally at the bottom, we append our h2 heading and the list to our body to display it in the browser. And of course, we then remove the link. So with that, we're finished. Make sure to save your file. Let's go into the browser and test it out. We'll refresh the web page, and let's click our link. And excellent, you can see that our JSON Ajax roadmap displays perfectly. So that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Now that we have a simple Ajax script, and we know how to handle some of the common server responses, let's work on improving our script to turn it into an easy-to-use Ajax library. Let's switch into our text editor, and let's open up our main.js file. Now the first thing that we can do to improve our Ajax script is to extract out all of this behind-the-scenes code into a separate file. What I mean by behind-the-scenes code is the creation of our XHR object, handling the onReadyStateChange event, and then opening and sending the request. If you think about it, when we or anyone else who might want to use our library wants to issue an Ajax request, they shouldn't have to be bothered with all of this extra code. So we need to simplify this process by hiding this behind-the-scenes code by creating a simple Ajax function that we can call to issue our Ajax requests with. So when our link is clicked on, it would be nice if we could do something like this. We should be able to call an Ajax method and pass it the URL to the file or web page that we're wanting to request as the first argument. So we could say that we want to request a file from the files folder named ajax.json. And then we should be able to pass in an object of options as a second argument. Now in the options, we should be able to set a method property so that we can tell it to do a get or post request. And we should also be able to set a complete callback function, which will be ran when our Ajax request is complete. And now inside of this complete callback function, we should be able to work with the XHR object through an argument that can be passed in. In this case, I named it response, and this would return back the response text for our Ajax request. So if you wanted to grab the response text of your Ajax request, you can just use the response variable. Now we also want to be able to use this keyword, which will reference the XHR object that this Ajax method will create, so that we can access any properties of the request. For instance, we could access the response text, or we could access the ready state, or the status, or any other property that we wanted. Now at this point, in our complete callback function, we could use the response, create some HTML elements, and insert them into the DOM, and update the page with the response. So for example, we could go down here into our onReadyStateChange event, and we could grab all of our code, starting at the body, all the way down to the removeChild method call. We can cut that out, and we can paste it into our complete callback function. Now remember, this is the code that's ran when our Ajax request is complete, and we're ready to update the page. Now, in order for this code to work properly inside of the complete callback function, we need to update this JSON variable to use our response variable instead of using xhr.responseText. Remember, this response variable will now be the same thing as xhr.responseText. And now this is a much cleaner and easier way to go about issuing an Ajax request rather than having to see or write all of this other code each time that's below it. Now, we wouldn't want to just create this Ajax function as a global function. Remember, we want to limit the amount of global functions and variables that we create. So instead, we want to namespace it by placing it inside of a JavaScript object. This object would be global, but then each method inside of it would be unique to that object, and this reduces the chance of overwriting someone else's Ajax function unless they're using the exact same namespace. So we would want to have access to a tuts+ object with this Ajax method that we can call. So this is how we want to be able to issue our Ajax requests. Now we just need to convert our current Ajax script to work in this manner by creating the tuts+ object and this Ajax method. Let's start by creating a new file to hold our Ajax library. So under the JS folder, I'll create a new file, and I'll save this as tuts+.js, and notice that I did use a capital T there for tuts+. Now inside of here, we'll create our global tuts+ object. We create a variable named tuts+. Again, that's with a capital T, and we just set this equal to an empty object. Now let's give our tuts+ object that Ajax method. So we use tuts+.ajax and set this equal to a function. So now if we look at how we call our Ajax method inside of our main.js file, you can see that it needs to accept this URL as the first argument, and then an object of options as the second argument. So let's go back into our tuts+ file, and let's have this accept the URL, and then the options. Now we need to have this Ajax function create an XHR object, handle the onReadyStateChange event, open the request, and finally send the request to the server. Now, not all of this should be handled specifically by the Ajax function alone. So what we're going to do is move the responsibility of creating an XHR object, handling the onReadyStateChange event, and opening the request into another function called createXHR. And then our Ajax function here will just call that createXHR function, which will return the newly created XHR object, or it'll return false if it wasn't able to create one. We can then check to make sure that we have an XHR object to work with, and we'll then send the request to the server. Now I know that may seem like a lot to take in at once, but it's basically the same code that we've done previously. It's now just split into two separate methods. So it would look something like this. We'll create an XHR variable, we'll use our tuts+ object, and call a createXHR method. Now this method is also going to need access to the URL and the passed-in options. So we need to pass those in here to our createXHR function when we call it. Now we need to check if we've successfully created an XHR object, as the browser may or may not support Ajax. So our XHR variable could hold an XHR object, which would evaluate to true, or it may be false. To do that, we can use an if statement and check if XHR. And if we do have an XHR object, we can then send the request to the server. We can grab that code from our main.js file. If we scroll down to the bottom, let's grab this statement here where we send the request. We'll just cut it out, go back into our tuts+ file, and paste it inside of our if statement. So that's it for our Ajax method. Now we just need to write this createXHR method to handle the dirty work of creating our XHR object. So above our Ajax method, let's create a new one in the tuts+ object. We'll name it createXHR. We set this equal to a function, and it needs to accept the URL and the options. So this method needs to return either an XHR object or false if it couldn't create one. Remember, our Ajax method down here is using the function's return value in a conditional. So let's start off by creating our XHR variable, and we'll give this a default value of false. Now we can go ahead and attempt to create our XHR object and reassign it to our XHR variable. We can actually grab this from our main.js file. If we look at the top here, you can see we have our statement where we create the XHR object. Let's just cut that out of there, and we'll paste it here inside of our create XHR method. And make sure that you remove the var keyword. As we're reassigning the XHR variable, we're not creating a new variable. So that will create our XHR object. But what happens if the browser doesn't support XML HTTP request? Well, to handle that situation, we should first check to make sure that we can create an XML HTTP request object with an if statement. So right above where we create our XHR object, we can use an if statement and check if window.xml HTTP request. And if the browser does support XML HTTP request, we'll go ahead and create our object. So we'll just cut this out and we'll paste it inside of the if statement. After our if statement, we can now use our XHR object in a conditional to make sure that we have an object to work with before we continue. So let's check if XHR. And now if we do have an XHR object to work with, we can then start working with the passed in options, setting the onReadyStateChange event handler for our complete callback function, and opening the request. On the other hand, if we don't have an XHR object, we'll use an else statement, and we'll just return false. Now inside of our if statement, if we do have an XHR object, the first thing we want to do is set up our options. So we need to give this options variable a default value if the options were not passed in for whatever reason. Remember, when our Ajax method is called, at the top up here, we pass in this object of options setting the method and the complete callback function. So back into our tuts+.js file, we can use options equals the current passed in options, or we set it to an empty object. So options will be equal to the passed in options, but if no options were passed in, we just give it a default value of being an empty object. Next, we need to set the method. Remember, here in our Ajax call, the user can pass in this method property, setting it to getterPost. So back here in our tuts+.js file, we can use options.method and set this equal to the method that was passed in, or by default, we can have this just do a get request if no method was set. Now, keep in mind that we haven't learned how to do post requests just yet, but we will soon enough. For now, we're just doing get requests and improving upon our Ajax code. Then later, we'll move on to working with post requests. All right, now that our options object and options.method have been set up, let's work on our onReadyStateChange event handler, which is where we'll set up the complete callback function that can be passed into our options. So let's just grab our code from this main.js file. We can grab the xhr.onReadyStateChange event handler. We'll just cut it out, go back into our tuts+ file, and we can paste it inside of our if statement here. Now inside of our if statement, inside of the onReadyStateChange event, this is normally where we would write our code to work with the server's response and update the web page with the return data, like we've done in previous lessons. But rather than hard code that into our createXHR method, if we look in our main.js file, you can see that we're allowing our users of our Ajax library to pass in this complete callback function as an option. And this complete callback will contain the code that the user would like to run when the Ajax request is complete. So back into our tuts+ file, inside of our if statement, we need to first check whether or not the user has set the complete callback as an option by checking for it in an if statement. So we'll say if options.complete, and now if the complete callback was set, we just need to run whatever code they put inside of the complete callback, meaning we need to execute this code inside of the complete function. Now, back here in our createXHR method, we could simply use options.complete, and that will fire the complete method, but the problem is, inside of the complete callback, the user is going to want to have access to the XHR object so that they can check out its properties, like the response text, or maybe the status, or do whatever else they'd like with the object. So alternatively, we could pass in our XHR object to the complete callback like this as an argument, and that would also work, but doing it in this way means that the this keyword inside of the callback points to the function's owner, which is not what we want. Instead, we want the this keyword inside of the callback to point to our XHR object, so that the user has access to anything about the request that they'd like. For example, let's go into our main.js file, and at the top here, inside of our complete callback function, the user should be able to use this, and then access the response text, or the ready state, or the status, or anything else they want to access inside of the XHR object for the current request. Let me just get rid of this, and let's go back into our tuts+ file. So there's a better way to execute our complete callback function, and that's by using its call method. Now you may or may not be familiar with the call method, so I'll go over it briefly. All functions in JavaScript have a call method, and this allows you to invoke your method and to change what its this keyword points to. And we can also optionally set the arguments that get passed into the method. So to do this, we can use options.complete and then call its call method. And now the first argument that we want to pass into the call method is what we want the this keyword to refer to. So we want this to refer to our XHR object. So we pass that in as our first argument. Now we can also pass in any arguments to the method, and these will be available to the user within the callback as well. In this case, we can make it really simple for the user to grab just the response text by passing this in as a second argument here. So we can use xhr.response text. So now in our complete callback function, the user could use the this keyword, or the user could use the passed in response variable to grab just the server's response alone, which is exactly what we're doing here, where we assign the response to our JSON variable. Remember, response is equal to the response text of the XHR object, so the user has multiple options. Let's get rid of this top statement here, as we don't need that. Now also, remember that in this example, we're requesting a JSON file, so we need to make sure that we parse our response text before we pass it to our complete callback function. So back into our tuts+.js file, here where we pass in the response, we can use json.parse to parse that response text. Now I realize that this won't work for plain text, HTML, and XML responses, but in the next lesson we'll see how we can identify each of those content types separately to handle the response in different ways. But for now, we're just going to have it respond to JSON. Then in the next lesson, we'll add in the other responses. So now our complete callback is finished, at least for JSON responses. Now outside of our onReadyState change event handler, yet still inside of our if condition where we're checking for the XHR object, we just need to open the request. So we can grab this from our main.js file. If we scroll down here, here's our statement. Let's just copy this, we'll cut it out, and back into our tuts+ file, we can paste it in here. Now instead of having the method and the URL being hard-coded into our open method here, we can use the arguments that the user passes in when they call our Ajax method. Remember, the user passes in the URL, and then the method is in the options object. So for the method here, we can use options.method, and for the URL, we can use our URL variable. And then after we open our XHR request, we just need to have this return our XHR object so that our Ajax method below can use it. Remember, down here in our Ajax method, we're using the return value of our create XHR method, and we're checking whether or not we have an XHR object to work with before we send the request. And that's it. We've improved our Ajax script by turning it into an Ajax library and made it much easier to use. So let's now go over what we've done in here real quick. So the user will be able to call our tuts+.ajax method to issue an Ajax request. They can pass in the URL of the file from the server that they want to request as the first argument, and they can also pass in a JS object as the second argument with some options for setting the requests method and for setting the complete callback function. Our Ajax method then tries to create an XHR object by calling our createXHR method. When we call this, we pass in our URL and the options. So now at the top here in our createXHR method, this needs to return either an XHR object or false. So we create an XHR variable and we give it a default value of false. We then check to make sure that the browser supports XML HTTP request. If it does, we create our XHR object. We then check to see if we have an XHR object to work with before trying to handle the onReady state change event or open the request. If we do have an XHR object to work with, we then set up our options that are passed in to the Ajax method with some default values. If for some reason no options are passed in, the options variable is defaulted to an empty JS object, and the method is defaulted to doing a GET request. Next, we handle our onReady state change event handler and check to see if the response is ready to be worked with, as we've done previously. At this point, we then check to see if the user has set the complete callback function. If it was set, we call the complete method's call method, setting its this keyword to point to our XHR object, and then we pass in the JSON parsed response text as an argument to it, so that the response text can now easily be accessed inside of the callback using the response variable. Afterwards, we then open the request, passing in the submitted method and the URL, and then we return the XHR object. If for some reason we couldn't create our XHR object up here, this method will just return false. So now back into our Ajax method. After calling the createXHR method, it then checks to see if we have an XHR object and whether it was created successfully. If so, we then send the request to the server. Alright, so hopefully I explained that well enough for you. It's essentially the same code that we wrote in our simple Ajax script, except now that it's broken into two separate methods, and we do more checking to ensure that the objects are available to be worked with. Let's save our file, and now let's go into our main.js file and finish up in here. Let's start by cleaning this file up a bit. We'll go ahead and remove all of our comments and the extra spaces. And now make sure that you're keeping this return false statement, as that ensures that the default behavior of clicking on our link is disabled so that it doesn't follow through when our onClick event handler is fired. So now all we need in order to issue an Ajax request is the tutsplus.ajax method call. We tell it to retrieve our JSON file. We then pass in an object to set the method to do a GET request. And we then set the complete callback function where we process the JSON response. In here we're using the response variable, which points to our response text. And then we just update the web page just like we did in the JSON lesson by creating some HTML elements and inserting them into the DOM. Now, just so you're clear about the differences between the main.js file and the tuts+js file. So this main.js file is going to act as our application's main JavaScript file, which will run the actual JavaScript code for our app. And the tuts+js file is a library or toolkit of code that is being used in our main.js file. So I hope you can see how much cleaner this code is now that we don't have all of that behind-the-scenes Ajax code cluttering up our main.js file. Now we only have to deal with calling a simple Ajax method and passing in a few options to do an Ajax request. So make sure to save this file, and the last thing we need to do is make sure to link in our tuts+js file into our index.html page. So let's open up index.html. And I'm just going to duplicate this line here. And right in between our JSON2 file and our main.js file, let's load in the tuts+.js file. So first we load in JSON2, then we load in the tuts+ library, and finally we load in the main JavaScript file. Okay, let's save our file, and we'll switch into our browser. And let's go to our web page, localhost/Ajax. And here's our page. Now I'm also just going to refresh my web page just to ensure that it's loading the newest files. And then I'm going to open up Firebug, and let's click on our link. And so it looks like I must have messed something up. Let's hit our back button here. And in the console, you can see that I have this error here, and it looks like I didn't open up the parenthesis for the json.parse method. So that's probably what's wrong. Let's go back into our text editor, and let's go into tutsplus.js. And yep, that's what I did. You can see there's no opening parenthesis for the parse method. So let's put that in here. So that should be json.parse, and then we pass in the XHR object's response text. Let's try it again. We'll save our file. Let's go back into the browser, and let's refresh, and let's try clicking our link. All right, awesome. Our Ajax library is now working perfectly. So that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next lesson. In the last lesson, we turned our simple Ajax script into an easy-to-use Ajax library, but currently it only supports processing JSON responses. So we need to make a few changes to it in order to detect the other responses, such as plain text, HTML, and XML, and handle each one accordingly. Let's switch into our text editor, and let's open up our tutsplus.js file. Now down here in our onReadyStateChange event handler, where we're checking if the complete callback has been set, you can see that we're just assuming that the response is JSON, as the response text that's being passed into our call method of our complete callback is being parsed using our JSON parser. Now remember, if we open up main.js and inside of our complete callback, whatever we pass in as the second argument to that call method becomes available inside of our complete callback as an argument. In this case, I've just named it response. So currently, every time we do an Ajax request, our response text is being parsed by our JSON parser. So back into our tutsplus file, instead of just assuming that the response is JSON, we want to check the XHR object's response header's content type to see whether or not we have JSON, XML, or plain text or HTML. This way, if we have a JSON response, we parse the response text using our JSON parser. If we have an XML response, we use the response XML property, and otherwise, that would mean we just have plain text or HTML. And in that case, we would just use the response text property alone. So to do this, we first need to get the response header's content type. Right above, where we check if the complete callback function was set, let's create a new variable. I'm going to name this content type, and we can use our XHR object, and it has a method named get response header, and then we can pass in the header that we're wanting to get. In this case, we want the content-type header. So now that we have the content type for the server's response held in this content type variable, we can use a series of if statements checking for JSON, XML, or plain text or HTML to handle each response differently. So back inside of our if statement, where we're checking if the complete callback function was set, let's now check if the content type equals application/JSON. So we'll create an if statement. We'll check if content type equals application/JSON. If so, that means we have JSON data being returned from the server. So we can just grab our statement here where we parse our response text, and let's paste it inside of our if statement, and that will parse our JSON response. Then we can use an else if statement, and this time let's check if the content type equals text/XML, or if content type equals application/XML. If so, that means that we've received XML from the server, and we can again set options.complete.call. So I'm just going to paste in the previous line from before. We'll get rid of the json.parse method call, and instead of having this use response text, since this is an XML response, we'll use response XML. Now lastly, we can use an else statement, meaning that if it's not JSON or XML, it's just plain text or HTML, both of which are handled just by using the response text property alone. So I'll paste in that line again, and let's just get rid of the json.parse method call. And all we're passing in this time is just the response text property. And with that, our script can now detect the different server responses and return back the appropriate data to our complete callback function. Let's now switch into our main.js file, and let's test each of the different responses out to see if our code's working properly. So right now, we're retrieving our ajax.json file, and that means our response variable should be a JSON object. So to make this easy to test everything out, I'm just going to remove all of the DOM scripting that we're doing inside of our complete callback function. I just deleted it all out of there. And I'm going to alert the value of our response.heading. Remember, since we're retrieving JSON, response should be a JSON object, and we should be able to grab its heading property. Okay, let's save our file. We'll switch into the browser and try it out. Let's go to our web page, localhost/Ajax. And I'm just going to refresh this to make sure it has the most recent files. I'll open up Firebug, and let's click on our link. And great, you can see that we get our pop-up with the JSON Ajax roadmap heading. So that means JSON is being processed correctly. Let's hit OK, and we'll go back into our text editor. And now let's change this to retrieve our ajax.xml file. And now our response variable should contain our response XML property. So let's alert the response, and we should be able to use our DOM methods and properties to retrieve its heading from our XML data. So we can use response.getElementsByTagName. We'll grab the heading element. Since there's only one, we just want the one at index 0. We then need to go into the first child and grab its node value to get that element's text. Let's save our file. We'll switch back into the browser. Let's refresh. We'll click on our link. And great, you can see that we get our pop-up, and this time it's just with the Ajax roadmap heading from our XML file. So that means XML is being processed correctly as well. Now we just need to make sure that we can process HTML or plain text responses. Let's go back into our text editor. And let's change this to retrieve our ajax.html file. And now our response variable should be just the regular response text property. So let's just alert the value of the response variable. Let's save our file. We'll jump back into the browser. We'll refresh and click on our link. And great, we get our pop-up with our HTML text. Let's now try just the plain text file. We'll go back into our text editor, and we'll change this to use ajax.txt. And again, response should just be the response text property, so we can leave it as is. We'll save our file, go back into the browser one last time, we'll refresh, click on our link, and perfect, we get the contents of our text file. All right, so our changes to our Ajax library are working as intended. We can now issue Ajax requests for plain text, HTML, XML, or JSON, and the responses are being processed accordingly to return the correct response back to the complete callback. So that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Currently, our Ajax library can only issue GET requests to the server. Now we want to add in the required code to do POST requests. This will allow us to send data to the server can then work with that data, and we can then update the page with the server's response. Now for this lesson, I'll be using PHP as my server-side language, but you should be able to adapt this code to work with any other server-side language that you prefer to work with instead. So we're going to start by creating a form that we can use to enter in an email address and validate that address with PHP by doing an Ajax POST request to the server. So PHP will determine whether the email is valid, and will then update the page with the server's response, which will either be a success or error message. Let's switch into our text editor, and let's open up our index.html file. And right after our link, which we've been using to issue our GET requests with, I'm going to create an H2 heading. This will just say Ajax POST requests. Now let's create our form. So we'll set the method to post. We'll set the action to go to our files folder, and then an ajax.php file. Then I'll just close the form. Now let's create a paragraph tag, and we'll just put the text email in here. And then we'll create our input form field for the email. We'll set the type to be text. We'll set the name to be email, and we'll give this an ID of email as well. Now after our paragraph, let's create our submit button. So we'll set the type to be submit, and we'll give this a value of validate. And that's it for our index.html page. Now we just need to create our ajax.php file. So under files, let's create a new file. I'll save this as ajax.php. Now inside of here, I'll open up my PHP tags. And let's start by grabbing the posted email and storing it into a variable. So I'll create an email variable, and we can use post and grab the posted email. Now normally you would want to clean and sanitize anything submitted from the user through a form, but that's not the point of this lesson. We just want to see how to do Ajax post requests, right? So we're going to validate the submitted email using a filter. We'll use an if statement, so we're checking if, filter var, and the value that we're wanting to validate is our email, and then the filter that we want to use is filter validate email. So if the validation passes, let's just echo out a success message. We'll wrap our message inside of paragraph tags. So this will just say success, and then I'll concatenate on the email that they entered, and then I'll concatenate another string onto here saying is valid, and we'll close the paragraph tag. Then we can use an else statement, meaning that the validation has failed, and in that case, we'll just echo out an error message. So again, we'll wrap this in a paragraph tag. This will just say error, and we'll concatenate on the email that they submitted, and we'll concatenate another string saying is not valid. Then we'll just close the paragraph. So that's it for our PHP file. And now our form and this PHP script should work even without Ajax. So let's try it out. Let's go into the browser. We'll go to our web page, localhost/Ajax, and here's our form. So we can enter in an invalid email address such as ajax.com and hit validate. And you can see that we get our error message saying that ajax.com is not valid. Let's go back. And now let's try a valid email. So ajax@gmail.com, and we'll hit validate. And this time we get our success message saying ajax@gmail.com is valid. So now that we know our form is working without any Ajax, let's add in the Ajax so that when we submit the form, we don't get sent to a separate page. Instead, we send the post request to the server, and we then update this page with the server's response, displaying the success or error message. So let's first take a look at how we want to be able to issue Ajax post requests. Let's switch back into our text editor, and I'm just going to open up main.js. And now after our onClick link event, where we do our normal get Ajax method call, let's do another one. So first we need to get a reference to our form so that we know when it's been submitted. I'll create a new variable named form. We can use document.getElementsByTagName. We'll grab all of the form elements. We only have one, so we just want the one at index 0. Now we need to handle the form's onSubmit event. We can use form.onSubmit, set this equal to a function. And just like when working with links, we need to have this return false at the end here so that we disable the form from following through with its default action, which is to submit to our ajax.php file. Now when the form is submitted, we want to grab the value from the email field. So let's store that in a variable. I'll create a new variable named email val, and we can use document.getElementById. Since we gave that form field, if you remember, we gave it this ID of email. So we can grab it using that email ID. And now this will just grab the email element. We actually need to grab its value, so we can use .value. Now before we can issue our Ajax request, we need to know where the form is supposed to submit to. We can grab this from the form's action attribute. So let's create another variable. I'll name this URL. We can use our form variable and call its getAttribute method to grab the value of its action attribute. So now this URL variable holds the value of our form's action attribute, which should be file/ajax.php. So now we can use this as the URL that we'll pass in to our Ajax method. So let's go back into main.js, and we can use our tuts plus object, call our Ajax method, pass in our URL, and we'll also pass in our empty object here for our options. Now let's set our method, and instead of doing a GET request, we're going to tell this to do a POST request. And now when doing POST requests, you usually are posting some kind of data to the server. So we need to pass in that data that should be sent along with our POST request. Remember, our PHP script is going to need the email field value in order to validate the email address. So we want to send that email to the server. So to pass in data along with our POST request, we should be able to set a data option when calling our Ajax method, and then we should be able to pass in an object to it. And then we can use key value pairs for whatever we want to send. So we could pass in the email field's value to the server with our POST request by setting an email key and setting its value equal to our email val variable. And then lastly, we just need to set our complete callback function. And inside of our complete callback, we just need to create a div to hold the server's response and append it to the body of our HTML page. So let's first get a reference to our body tag. We can use document.getElementsByTagName. We'll grab all of the body tags. We should only have one, so that's at index 0. We then need to create our div element. So I'll create a variable named d. We can then use document.createElement. We'll create a div element, and then we just need to append this div to our body. So we use body.appendChild and pass in our div. So now that the div has been inserted into the DOM, we just need to get a reference to it and then update its inner HTML to hold our response from the server. Let's create another variable named div. We'll use document.getElementsByTagName. We'll grab all of the div elements. We should only have the one that we just created, so we can access that at index 0. And then we can set the div's inner HTML to be our response. All right, so here's how we want to be able to issue our Ajax POST requests. It's pretty much the same thing as doing a GET request. We specify the URL, which we're grabbing from our HTML form's action attribute. We then say to do a POST request. We then pass in the data that we want to send to the server along with our request. In this case, it's just the email field's value. And then we set our complete callback function to update the page with the server's response, which could be either a success or error message from our PHP script. Now we just need to modify our Ajax library to accommodate doing POST requests. Let's switch into our tutsplus.js file. And so the very first thing we want to do is not actually related to just POST requests. This is also relevant to doing GET requests. And that is, we should make sure that before we send our Ajax request to the server, that we set a request header so that our server knows that we're doing an Ajax request. To do this, down here inside of our Ajax method, inside of our if statement, where we're checking if we have an XHR object to work with, let's use our XHR object and set a request header. To set a header, we can call its set request header method. And the first argument is the header that you want to set. In this case, we want to set an x hyphen requested hyphen with header. And then the second argument is the value. In this case, we want to set an XML HTTP request. And that's all there is to setting a request header. So now when our Ajax requests are sent, the server can identify between regular requests and Ajax requests if needed. And we'll actually be using this functionality later on in the course in our hands-on application. But we added this in now as it's good practice. Let's now move on to issuing POST requests. Now, unlike GET requests, POST requests require that you set a content type request header so that it knows that you're doing a POST request and that you're sending it some data that it'll have to process. Now, we only want to set the content type request header if we're doing a POST request. So right after where we set our x requested with Ajax header, let's use an if statement. And we're just going to check if the passed in method in our options is equal to post. So we can use options.method, and then I'm going to call the toUppercase method to convert this to uppercase, as that just makes it easy to compare. And then we're checking if this equals the string post in all caps. So now if we're doing a post request, we can use our XHR object, and we'll set another request header using the setRequestHeader method. This time the header that we want to set is called content-type, and then the value is going to be application/x-www-form-URL encoded. And now because of this request header, our server will know that we're doing a post request and that we're sending it some data. Next, we're going to need to modify our send method's passed in argument. If you remember from a previous lesson, I said that the send method here can either take in the data that should be sent to the server when doing a post request, or you just pass in null for doing a GET request. So instead of always just passing in null, which is what we were doing with our GET requests, we need to pass in the submitted data option. So we can use options.data. Now we still have to give this data option a default value. Remember, it can either be null for GET requests, or it can be an object of data which the user will pass in to be sent to the server for post requests. So let's do that. Let's go up to the top here in our createXHR method, and here where we set our other options values, let's give this data option a default value. So we set options.data equal to the passed in data, or if nothing was passed in for data, we just set this to null, which would then be used for GET requests. So now this options.data that we pass into our send method here will work for both GET and post requests. Now the last change we need to make in order to do post requests is we need to format the submitted data that will be sent to the server in a proper way. So we're going to need to format whatever was passed in to our options.data. Currently this data is being submitted as an object. So if we look in our main.js file, you can see that we're passing in this object with the email and the email val variable. Now by passing it in as an object, this allows us to easily pass in multiple key value pairs of data. But the problem is, since it's coming in as an object, and we're passing that straight into our send method, this is not going to work. The send method actually requires a query string of data to be passed in with URL encoded keys and values. For example, just going to duplicate this line, and then I'll just get rid of options.data real quick. So our send method is expecting to receive a string similar to this. First would be the key, email, and then an equal sign, and then the value that was submitted, such as ajax@gmail.com. And now the server would be able to read this string with email as the key, which could then be read in a PHP file. If you remember, in our PHP file, we used the post variable here to grab the email that was posted to the server. And then its value would be the ajax@gmail.com. So what we need to do is parse through our data object that we're passing into this and turn this object of keys and values into a query string that the send method will be able to accept. So I'm just going to get rid of this line here, the extra send method call, and back up here into our createXHR method, right after where we set the options default value. Let's first check to make sure that the user has given us some data before we attempt to convert it to a query string. So we'll use an if statement. We'll check if options.data. And now to convert our data object of key value pairs into a query string, what we'll do is loop over the data object, grabbing the keys and the values, URL encoding them to encode any special characters, and then we'll push this data into an empty array. We can then use the array and join it to turn it into a query string that our send method will accept. So if we have data to work with, we start by creating a new variable. I'm going to name this QString, that's just short for query string, and we'll set this equal to an empty array. Now this QString array is going to hold the individual key and value pairs that we'll get from our data object. Now let's just use a for in loop to loop over all of our data. So we'll create our for in loop. We'll create a variable named key in options.data. And now we can push the keys and values into our QString array, separating the key and the value with an equal sign. So we can use our QString array, call its push method, and now we'll push the key plus an equal sign and then the value into the QString array. So we'll use our key, then we'll concatenate a string, which will hold the equal sign, and then we'll concatenate the value. We can get the value by using options.data, and then using bracket syntax, we can pass in the key. Now when you're creating your query strings, you want to make sure to URL encode both the key and the value. So we can do that by using an encode URI component method. We use encode URI component and just pass the key into it. And then we do the same thing for the value. Encode URI component and pass the value into that. And that will take all of our data, create a string out of it, and stick it into our QString array. Now outside of the loop, our array holds URL encoded key and value pairs, and each pair is separated by an ampersand. Now we just need to take each one from the array and join it into a string by splitting it on the ampersands. So when we encode the key and the value, should we have multiple key value pairs, they'll be separated by an ampersand. So by splitting it on those ampersands and reassigning it to our options.data property, we can create our single query string. So we can set options.data to now be equal to our query string. We can use our QString variable, call its join method, and join it on ampersands. And that will convert the submitted data object into a query string that our send method will be able to send to the server. And with that, we're now able to do Ajax post requests. So to summarize, before issuing a post request, always make sure to set the content type request header so that the server knows that you're sending it data. And then also make sure to pass in the data that you're sending to the server properly formatted as a URL encoded query string, just like we're doing here with our send method. So let's save our file. And now let's just take a look at our main.js file once more. So when the form is submitted, we're going to be doing a post request to the URL that we're grabbing from the form's action attribute. We're then passing in some data, which is the email field that we grabbed from our form. And then we're updating the page with the server's response by creating a div, and then we just insert the response into the DOM. So let's give this a try. Let's switch back into our browser. Let's refresh the page. I'm going to open up Firebug, and you can see that it's remembering our valid email address that we entered in before, so we'll just reuse that. Let's hit validate, and excellent. You can see that we get our success message saying the ajax@gmail.com is valid, and we didn't get sent to the other page. The message was updated and inserted right into this page for us using Ajax. So let's try an invalid one now. We'll use ajax.com and hit validate. And you can see that it changes and now displays our error message. So now if we take a look at one of our post requests in Firebug, we can just click on it. And then if we click on this headers tab, and if we scroll down to the request headers section, you can see that our request sent the proper content type header as well as the X requested with header, just like we asked it to. Now back up to the top, we can also click on this post tab, and down here in the source section, you can see the query string that we created. This is the email key, and then the value is whatever was submitted from the email form. In this case, it's the ajax.com string, which was an invalid string, or an invalid email, I should say. So we now have a very flexible Ajax library, which can distinguish between multiple server responses, as well as adapt to handling both GET and POST Ajax requests. But that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next lesson. In this lesson, I'd like to add 2 new features to our Ajax library to help with providing the users of our web apps with some visual feedback while the Ajax request is loading, and to also give them a visual cue that the Ajax request has completed. So let's start by providing some feedback to our users while the Ajax request is loading. If we look at our app in the browser, and we try validating an email such as ajax@gmail.com and hit validate, you can see that since we're on our local machine, that this request loads and returns the response very quickly. But in a production environment, this may slow down a bit. For example, let's go into our text editor and let's open up our ajax.php file. And right before our if statement, where we print out the message, either the success or error message, let's call the sleep function and tell it to sleep for 2 seconds. So essentially, this means that our PHP script is going to wait for 2 seconds before it returns back our response. Now, you wouldn't want to add in this sleep function on a production web application. Remember, I'm just doing this to simulate a slower request. So I'll save my file. Let's go back into the browser. We'll refresh the page, and let's submit the form. Now you can see that this time the server took a few seconds to give us the response, which is what may happen on a production server, and the user may be left wondering what's going on while the Ajax request is loading. They don't know if it's broke or if they've done something wrong. So to let the user know that it's loading, let's add a before callback to our Ajax script so that we can give the user a loading notification. Let's go back into our text editor, and let's open up our main.js file. And down here in our post Ajax request, what we want to be able to do is set a before callback function, just like we did with our complete callback function. Now the difference is that the code we stick in the before callback is going to be executed while the XHR object's ready state is at 1, which is the loading state. And again, we'll give the user access to the XHR object by making it available in the this keyword. So now in this before callback, we can run any kind of code that we want to run while we're waiting for the Ajax request to load and complete. For example, how about we take the code from our complete method, where we get the reference to the body, and we create the div, then we append it to the body, and then we get a reference to it. So let's just grab this, we'll cut it out, and right above our Ajax method call, outside of it, let's paste this in up here. Just going to fix up the indentation a bit, get rid of that extra space. And now we'll be able to use this div to update it with a loading message in our before callback. And then when the request is complete, we can change its value to display the response in the complete callback. So I'm just going to get rid of this extra space here. So now in our before callback, we can use our div element, and we'll set its inner HTML to just be a loading message. We'll wrap this in a paragraph tag, and this will just say loading. Then we'll close the paragraph. So now when we issue our Ajax post request, while the request is loading, we display a loading message to the user so that they know what's going on, just in case the server is running slowly. Then when it's complete, we update the page, meaning we update that div with the response, just like normal. Now we just need to add in this before callback to our Ajax library. So we'll save our file, and let's open up tutsplus.js. And down here in our onReadyStateChange event, at the very top, before we check if the ready state is complete, let's use another if statement, and this time we're going to check if the request is loading. So we check if xhr.readystate is equal to 1. If the ready state is loading, we then need to check if the before callback has been set. So we'll use another if statement, and we'll check if options.before. And so if the before callback was set, now we just want to fire off the code that was placed in the before callback, just like we did with our complete callback down here. So we can use options.before and call its call method, and then pass in our XHR object so that it's this keyword points to our XHR object. All right, we should now have a working before callback that's ran while the Ajax request is loading. And so when we call our Ajax method inside of our main.js file, we can now set this before callback to run any code that we'd like to let the user know that the request is loading. Let's give it a try. We'll go into the browser, make sure to refresh your page, and now when we submit our form, you can see that we're getting this loading message so that we know what's going on, and we're not just left sitting here wondering. And then when the request completes, it updates the page with the response. So let's try it again. We'll submit the form once more. There's our loading message, and then it updates with the server's response. Awesome. Now, you don't have to use the loading text here that I'm using. You could run any kind of code that you wanted inside of that before callback. Instead of using the loading text, you could display one of those loading animated GIFs. It's up to you. All right, now that the user has some feedback on what's happening while the request is loading, let's also give them a visual cue that the request has completed, so that they know that the page has been updated with some new data. We can do this just by using some JavaScript to quickly change the background color of the div that the response is inserted to. So when the Ajax request is completed, we'll just make this div's background color change to yellow real quickly, and then it'll go back to white. And this will let the user know that the page has been updated. So let's go back into our text editor, and here inside of our main.js file, down here in our complete callback, so when our Ajax request is complete and we've updated the DOM with the response, we should be able to call our tuts+ object and a flash method, and then pass in an HTML element that we would like to flash, which in this case is our div, which is holding the response. All right, let's now write this flash method. Make sure to save your file. Let's switch back into our tuts+.js file, and let's go to the bottom here, and we'll write a new method. We use tuts+.flash, set this equal to a function, and this needs to accept one parameter, and that's the HTML element that we're flashing. And now to flash the element to yellow and then back to white, we'll first change the element's background color style. So we can set our element's style and then its background color to yellow. And now after it turns to yellow, we just need to turn this back to having a white background color, as we only want this to display the yellow background color for a short amount of time. Remember, it's just flashing to yellow to let the user know briefly that the request is complete, and then it'll go back to white. So we need the background color to stay yellow for just a few milliseconds, and then turn it back to white. To do that, we can use the setTimeout method, which will run some code after so many milliseconds have passed. So we can use window.setTimeout, and we pass it an anonymous function as the first argument. Then the second argument is how long it should wait before running the code in our anonymous function. We can set it to 300 milliseconds, which is just under half a second. So now inside of our anonymous function, we can tell it to change the background color back to white. So we set our element's style and its background color to white. And that will flash the passed in HTML element's background color to yellow, and then quickly change it back to white. In this case, remember, if we go back into our main.js file, we've passed in our div, which holds our response. So our div here will be flashed to yellow, then back to white. All right, let's give it a try. We'll go back into our browser and refresh the page. Let's submit the form. We get our loading message, and then the page flashes to yellow quickly, and then it turned right back to white to let us know that the Ajax request is complete and that we have new data here to be viewed on the page. Perfect. Let's try it once more. We'll submit the form. And great, everything's working. Now, just like with the before callback, the flash code that we wrote is not set in stone. You don't have to flash the background color to yellow if you don't want to. You may prefer to do something else. This was just an example of how to give the user some visual feedback when your Ajax requests are complete. So now not only is our Ajax library flexible and easy to use, it's also user-friendly to the viewers of our web apps. But that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next lesson. So far, our Ajax library should work in most modern browsers and newer Internet Explorer browsers. But if you'd like to use our library in older browsers, such as IE6, our current code will not work. Now, in order to show you this in action on my Mac, I'm using a Windows XP virtual machine. So you can see I have this window here with Windows XP running, and I've got IE6 opened up. So I'm just going to browse to my application. On this virtual machine, I have to go to mac.localhost/Ajax. And here's our application running in IE6. And let's try clicking on our link to do an Ajax GET request. So if we click on the link, you can see that nothing's happening. Try clicking on it again, nothing happens. Let's also try submitting our form. So I'll put an email in here and we'll hit validate. And again, nothing. So you can see that we have no Ajax support for IE6. Now it's up to you whether or not you want to support IE6. I'm in favor of just letting it die out and not support IE6 at all. But I know some of you out there watching this may want to see how we could make this work for older browsers such as IE6. And it's actually really easy to do, so let's get started. I'm going to switch into my text editor, and let's open up our tutsplus.js file. And now the reason that our Ajax library doesn't work in IE6 is that it does not support this XML HTTP request object. Since that's not supported, our createXHR method here is just returning false. And so when our Ajax method down here tries to create an XHR object, it doesn't actually send the request because there's no object to work with. So instead of using XML HTTP request, older IE browsers use an ActiveX object, but the newer IE browsers also support this XML HTTP request object. So we'll first check if the browser supports XML HTTP request like we're already doing. And if for some reason it does not support XML HTTP request, that likely means we're in an older version of IE. So we need to assign an ActiveX object to our XHR variable instead. So we can use an else if statement, and we'll check if window.ActiveX object. And if the browser supports ActiveX object, we'll go ahead and create an ActiveX object, storing it into our XHR variable. So we use XHR and set this equal to a new ActiveX object, and we just pass in a string here that says Microsoft.xml_HTTP. Now, just in case this is not supported for some reason and it throws an error, let's use this statement within a try and catch block. So we'll wrap this within a try statement. There we go. And now if it throws an error, we'll catch it in a catch statement and just assign the XHR variable equal to false. That way, if it's not supported or it throws an error, the ActiveX object isn't even created. So we use catch, and inside of the catch statement, we can assign the XHR variable a value of false. And with that small amount of code, we now have support for older versions of Internet Explorer. Now I'm just going to switch back into my virtual machine, and I'll refresh Internet Explorer. And let's click on our link. And great, you can see we get our pop-up, and our Ajax request was successful. Let's try our post request. We'll submit the form. And excellent, we get our success message. So now let's make sure that it still works in a modern browser like Firefox. So I'm just going to refresh the page here, and let's click on our link. There we go, we get our pop-up, and let's submit the form. All right, so it's still working in modern browsers as well. So that's how you can go about modifying your Ajax library to accommodate both modern browsers and older IE browsers. But that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next lesson. In this lesson, I want to discuss how to prevent your browser from caching your Ajax GET requests. This is mostly an issue with Internet Explorer, but I have noticed it happening in Firefox and Chrome as well, but it seems to be intermittent. But it's definitely a problem in Internet Explorer. Now, what I mean by caching our GET requests is that when we retrieve a file from the server once with a GET request, it caches that file's contents. So the next time we attempt to do a GET request for that file, if the contents were changed, we're still going to be viewing the old version since it was cached. So let me show you what I mean. And just like last time, I'll be using a virtual machine to test out Internet Explorer. So here's my app inside of IE6. Now let's go ahead and click on our link here to issue our GET request to retrieve our Ajax text file. So you can see that the contents pop up here in this alert, and that worked just fine. So now let's switch into our text editor, and let's open up our ajax.txt file, and I'm just going to modify its contents. So right at the beginning, I'll just put the word modified. We'll save the file. Let's go back into Internet Explorer. I'll refresh the page. And when I click on the link, you can see that our file has been cached. We're still getting the old version of the file, as it's not displaying the words modified. So I'll hit OK, and we'll just double check. We'll refresh again, click our link, and yep, it's being cached. So now this mostly just happens in Internet Explorer, although as I said, I have experienced it happening in both Firefox and Chrome intermittently. Now, this only happens with GET requests, so you don't have to worry about this when doing your POST requests. Now, in some situations, you may want the browser to cache your GET requests, as you may have files that are being retrieved, which are rarely updated. And to increase the performance of your app, this caching can help speed things up. So we don't want to disable caching permanently. We just want this to be an option that we can pass in when we call our Ajax method to set caching to false, and that would turn caching off for the current Ajax GET request. So let me show you how to prevent your Ajax GET requests from caching themselves. Let's go back into our text editor, and let's open up our main.js file. And here in our Ajax method call, where we're doing our GET request, we should be able to set a cache option to false, and that would disable caching for this GET request. Now we just need to write this behavior inside of our tutsplus.js file. So let's open up tutsplus, and right above our onReadyStateChange event handler, we first need to check if the cache option was set and if it's equal to false. So we'll use an if statement, and we'll check if options.cache equals false. Now we also need to check if we're doing a GET request, as this feature is not needed on POST requests. So we're going to check if options.cache equals false, and if options.method, and then again we'll convert it to uppercase using toUppercase. So we're checking if options.method equals get. So now if the cache option is false and we're doing a GET request, we know that we should disable caching. Now, an easy way to tell the browser to make sure that it fetches the most recent version of our file and that it doesn't cache it is to append a unique query string to the end of the URL that's being submitted to the server. So each time the GET request is fired with that unique query string to the browser, it looks like a new file is being requested, and thus it grabs the most recent version each time without caching the contents. So we have access to the URL for the file that we're requesting using our URL variable, and the contents of that URL variable is just a string pointing to the location of the file that we're wanting to request. So it would look something like this, files/ajax.txt. So what we want to do is attach a unique query string onto this URL. So it would look something like this. We start with a question mark to separate the URL from the query string. We then use an underscore as the key. That way we can identify this on the server side. We then use an equal sign, and then we put in a unique value. So we could use like 1234. But we don't just want to hard code in a value like this, such as 1234, as that won't be unique each time the request is fired. To get a unique value, we can use the current date by creating a new date object and grabbing its time. So we'll get rid of the 1234, leaving the equal sign, and then we'll concatenate on a new date object, and we'll call its getTime method. Now, of course, we don't want to be hard coding in the URL like this, so let's switch it back to using our URL variable. So we'll just delete this out of here, and we're just leaving the question mark, the key, the equal sign, and then the unique value, which is our date. So let's just concatenate the URL onto the beginning. So this will create our URL with a unique query string on the end of it. Now we just need to assign it back into our URL variable. So now when our URL is passed into our open method down here, it contains our unique query string, ensuring that the browser doesn't cache our GET request. So let's save this file and back into our main.js file. And now whenever we want to make sure a browser doesn't cache our GET requests, we just set this cache option to false. Let's now give it a try. I'll switch into my virtual machine. I'll refresh Internet Explorer, and let's click on our link. And great, you can see now we're getting the most recent version of our file as we have the word modified here. So let's change the file again. I'll go back into my text editor, go into ajax.txt, and we'll have this say modified to, Let's go back into Internet Explorer. We'll refresh, click on our link, and there we go. It says modified to. And perfect. We no longer have to deal with that pesky caching issue on our GET requests. So that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Okay, so now we're ready to take our complete Ajax library and use it to build a small Ajax search application using the Laravel PHP framework. Now, it's not going to be a large or fancy application by any means. The main point here is so that you can see how to integrate your own Ajax library into a server-side framework, which will be pulling data from a database rather than just a JSON or XML file. Our app will then send the response back to our script, and we can update the page accordingly. To get started, we first need to install Laravel. I'm going to do that using Composer. If you don't know how to use Composer or don't have it installed, you can do a simple Google search and you should find lots of help online. So I'm first just going to change directories into my sites directory, and then I can run Composer, create-project, Laravel/Laravel, and then we just give our project a name. So I'm just going to name it Laravel-Ajax, and that'll take a few minutes to install. Okay, Composer is finally finished. Now I can just list out my sites directory's contents, and you can see we have our Laravel-Ajax application. Now, even if you've never used the Laravel PHP framework before, you should still be able to follow along with this lesson. I'll be walking you through writing all of the Laravel code. I just won't be explaining why it's doing what it's doing. So if you want to learn more about Laravel, be sure to check out the Laravel Premium courses here on Tuts Plus Premium. So now I'm just going to change directories into my Laravel Ajax directory. And just to be sure everything is installed, I'm going to run Composer install. And yep, we're good to go. Now we just need to make sure that Laravel's app storage directory has write access. So I'm going to use sudo changemod -r for recursive. We'll set it to 755, and that's the app/storage directory. Now I'll just enter in my password, and now we just need a database to work with. I'm using phpMyAdmin to manage a MySQL database, and you can see that I've already created this Laravel-Ajax database in advance. It's currently completely empty. It has no tables. We'll be using Laravel's migrations to create our table in just a few minutes. So once you've created your database, let's now connect our Laravel application to it. I'll go back into my terminal, and I'm going to open up the Laravel application into Sublime. So I can just run Sublime and a dot, and that opens it up. Now under app, config, let's open up database.php, and down here in the database connection name, you can change this to use whatever database you'd like. I'm using MySQL, so I'll just leave it alone. Then down here in the database connections, you can enter in your database credentials. So I'm going to change the host to use 127.0.0.1, and the database name is Laravel-Ajax, and I'll leave the username and password just as they are. Then I'll just save the file. All right, so now that we're connected to our database, we can create our users table, which we'll be using to pull data from for our Ajax search app. Just going to close out database.php, and I'll switch back into my terminal. And to create our migration, we can run php artisan migrate :make, and then we just need to give our migration a name. I'll name mine create_users_table. There we go, our migration file was created. Now we just need to edit this in our text editor. So back into Sublime, under Database, Migrations, open up the newly created migration file, and inside of our up method here, we'll use the schema builder to create a users table. So we'll use the schema class, call its static create method, and then we just need to pass in a string to tell it the table that we want to create. In this case, we want to create a users table. Then we just need to pass in a closure here and a table object that we'll use to create the table with. Now for our table schema, I'm just going to keep it really simple. As for our Ajax search app, we'll just be searching for users by their name. So let's start by giving our table an auto-incrementing primary key field, and I'll just name it ID. So we can do that by using table, calling its increments method, and passing it in the string ID to create that ID field. Now we need a field to hold the user's name. So we'll use table, call it string method, and tell it to create a name field. And then lastly, for our schema, we need to create some timestamp fields. So we can use table and call its timestamps method. Now we just need to fill in the down method to reverse the migration. So we can use the schema class, call its drop method, and tell it to drop the user's table. All right, let's now run our migration to create this user's table in our database. We'll go back into our terminal, and we can run php artisan migrate. There we go, that creates our table. Now that we have our users table, we just need to seed it with some sample users that we can use for our Ajax search. Let's go back into our text editor, and we can close out this migration file. And under database, seeds, let's create a new file. And I'm going to save this as users table seeder.php. Now inside of here, we just need to create a class. So we'll open up our PHP tags. Then we'll create a class named users table seeder, and this will extend the seeder class. Now we just need to define a run function, which will be used to seed our database with the data. So we'll create a new public function. We'll name this run. And now inside of here, since Laravel by default ships with a sample user model, if you look under models, you can see the sample model here. So we can use this and call its create method to create a new user. So back inside of our run method, we can use user, call its static create method, and just pass in an array, and now we can fill in the fields for the new user. We only have one field, which is the name field, so I'll just set this to my name for the first user, Andrew Perkins. Now I'm just going to duplicate this user to create several other sample users off camera. Okay, I'm back, so you can see I've created a few other users. Now you should have done the same to create your own users so that you have some users to test with in the application. Now we just need to tell our database seeder file to call this class's run method. So make sure to save your file. We can close this out, and under seeds, open up database seeder.php. And you can see we have this comment here on how to call one of our seeder classes. In this case, it's using user table seeder. I named mine users table seeder, so I just add in the S there. And now we can seed the database with these sample users that we put into our seeder class. Make sure to save your file. We can close this out. Let's switch back into our terminal. And we can now run php artisan db:/seed. There we go. You can see it says database seeded. So now we have some data to work with. Now let's also make sure to copy over our Ajax library and the JSON2 file into our new Laravel application. To do that, we first need to create a JS folder inside of our Laravel applications public folder. So if we go back into our text editor, and if you look in the public folder, you can see that there's no other folders in here besides this packages. So inside of public, I'll create a new folder named JS, just to hold our JavaScript files. Now I'll jump back into my terminal, and now I'm just going to change directories back into that Ajax folder that we were working with while creating our Ajax library. So that was under site/Ajax. And if we list out the contents of this directory, you can see we have our JS folder here, so we actually need to go into that folder as well. Let's list this out again. And here's our library, tutsplus.js and JSON2.js. So now we just need to copy these two files into our public JS folder that we just created. So we can use the cp command to copy, tell it to copy the tutsplus.js file and the JSON2.js file, and now we just need to tell it where to copy it to. So we want this to go into our sites directory, then into the Laravel Ajax application, then inside of the public directory, and into that JS directory that we just created. So we can hit enter, and that'll copy those files in there. We can verify that they were copied by looking in the JS folder, and there we go. Here's our JSON parser and our tutsplus Ajax library. All right, now the last thing we want to do is start up our server and make sure that our app works in the browser. So we can switch to our terminal, and we can run php-s. This will be on localhost port 8888, and then point this to our public directory. Whoops, it looks like I'm still inside of our old Ajax. So we actually need to change directories back into our Laravel Ajax application. Here we go. Now let's run that command again, php-s, localhost port 8888, and point this to the public directory. There we go. Our server has been started. Let's switch into our browser. I'll just open up a new tab here, and we can go to localhost port 8888. And great, here's our application. So now we're all set up and ready to begin building our server-side code. But that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Now that we have our Laravel application set up, let's begin writing the server-side code for the application. This will include creating a layout file with a little bit of HTML, writing the PHP needed to search our users, and then we'll link in and write some CSS to make the page look pretty. So let's switch into our text editor, and let's start by creating our layout file. So under App, Views, let's create a new folder. I'm going to name this Layouts, and then inside of Layouts, let's create a new file. I'll save this as main.blade.php, and inside of here I'll just insert some basic HTML. Now for the title, I'll set this to be Ajax User Search App. And then down here in our body, let's create a couple of divs. I'm first going to create a div with an ID of container, and then inside of that div, we'll create another div with an ID of content. So inside of our content div, now let's just yield a content section. So we can use @yield and tell it to yield a content section. Now anytime that we create a view file, we can tell it to use this main layout file and just wrap all of our view code in a content section, and it'll be output right here into our layout. Now let's create our user's controller. So under App, Controllers, let's create a new file. I'll save this as userscontroller.php. Notice I have an uppercase U and an uppercase C. Now let's just open up our PHP tag, and we'll create a new class. I'll name this Users Controller, exactly the same as the file name, and this extends the base controller class. Now in order to protect our app from CSRF attacks, we'll use the CSRF before filter by applying it to all post requests. So we'll do this inside of our constructor. Let's create a new public function. Its name will be __construct. So inside of here, we can use this and call the before filter method. The filter that we're going to be applying is the CSRF filter, and then we can pass in an array as the second argument and tell this to apply this filter on post requests. Now let's create an action to display a form so that we can search users as well as display a list of all of the users in our database. So let's create a new public function. We'll first prefix it with the get HTTP verb, and then the action name will be index. Now inside of here, we just need to return a view file and bind all of the users from our database to the view in a users variable. So we can do this with a single line. We use return, call the view class's make method. We tell this to display a view file from within our users folder. We'll create that in a minute. And the view file that we want to display is an index view file. We'll also create that in a few minutes as well. Now we can chain on the with method call to bind a user's variable to the view. And then the second argument that we pass in is what's going to be held within that user's variable. So we want to query our database and grab all of our users from it and store it in this user's variable. So we can use our user model, call its order by method, tell this to order all of the users by their name field, and then we just call the get method to grab all of those users. And that's it for our index action. So this is going to handle displaying a form as well as displaying a list of users from our database. Now that form is going to be used to search through our users. So it's going to be doing a normal post request to another action named search. And that action is going to take the submitted search keyword from the form. It's going to do a database query to find all of the users who match that search keyword, and it'll return all of those users back to the view. So we might as well create that action that our form's going to submit to while we're here inside of our controller. So let's create a new public function. This time we'll prefix the action name with the post HTTP verb, since our form's going to be doing a post request, and then the action name will be search. So when our form's submitted, it'll do a normal post request to this search action. And we just need to return back a view file with the search results bound to the view in a user's variable, just like we did up here in the getIndex action. Now the only difference will be our database query. Instead of just finding all of the users and ordering them by name, this time we need to do a where query to find users where their name is like the submitted search keyword from the form. So again, we'll return, call the view class's make method. This will display a view from within the users folder, which we'll create in a few moments, and the view file will be named index. We'll again chain on the with method call to bind a user's variable to the view file, and now we just need to perform our database query. So we can use the user model, call its where method, and we want to find users where the name field is like the submitted search keyword. We can get the submitted search keyword using the input class's get method, and we grab the submitted name. Now we also need to concatenate a % onto the end of the name so that we can do a partial search in the database. This way, if we enter in the letters AND and we hit search, it'll find the user Andrew as well, since it's just going to do a partial search for those letters. Now after our with method call where we bind the users to the view, we need to make sure to call the get method. So now we have our getIndex action for displaying a search form and a list of users that we've pulled from the database. And we also have our post search action, which we can use to have our form submit to perform the search. Let's save our file. And now we need to set up our routes. So under app, open up routes.php. And let's get rid of this default route in here as we won't be using it. And we can use the route class, call its controller method. And now we can set it to where all actions for our user's controller will be available under /users. Notice that you don't have to include the slash though. You can just put in the string users. And then we just need to set this to use our user's controller. So we pass that in as a second argument here. And so with these routes, we can now access all of our actions at localhost port 8888 /users /the action name. For instance, we could go to /users /index to get our index page, which displays our form and the list of users. All right, let's just get rid of this. And now I also want the root of our application to point to our user's index page. For example, we should be able to go to just localhost port 8888, and that would take us to our user's index page. So at the top here, right above our controller routes, let's use the route class and call its get method. And we'll set the URI to just be a /, which is the root of our application. And then we pass in an array as the second argument. We set the uses key, and we tell this route to use our user's controller and the get index action. And you can see that we're just separating the controller name and the action name with an @ sign. All right, so our routes are finished. Let's now create our view files. Let's save this file. If we look in our controller, you can see that we need to first create this users folder to hold our users' view files, and then we need to create the index view file itself. So under app, views, let's create a new folder. I'll name this users, and inside of users, we'll create a new file. I'll save this as index.blade.php, and we'll start by telling this view file to use our main layout that's in our layouts folder. So we use @extends layouts.main, and then we just need to wrap all of our view code into a content section. So we use @section content, and then we stop the section by using @stop. Now inside of here, I'll create an h1 heading. This will just say search users, and then we'll start by displaying a form that we can use to search our users with. So we can use form, call its open method, pass in an array here, and tell it to submit to an action. So this is going to submit to our user's controller and that post search action that we created earlier. Now let's make sure that the CSRF before filter that we applied in our user's controller works by creating our token. So we can use form and call the token method. Now we just need to create a label and a text field to enter in the name that we're searching for. So we can use form, call the label method, and tell it to create a label for the name field. Now let's create the name text field. So we use form, call the text method, and pass it the string name for the name text field. Now we need our submit button. So we'll use form, call it submit method, and then the text on the button is just going to say search. And then lastly for the form, we just need to close it. So we use form and call its close method. All right, now after our form, let's display that list of users that we pulled from our database using our users variable. Remember, in our controller, we have access to all of the users from the database in this users variable inside of our view. So we'll just display all of those users in an unordered list. Let's create the UL tag. And now inside of the list, we just need to loop over all of the users and display their name in a list item tag. So we can use @ForEach to create a for each loop. So we're looping over all of the users as user. Then we just need to end the for each loop. And now inside of our loop, we'll create a list item tag to display each user's name. Now, since I know that we're going to be adding in our Ajax in the next lesson, it would be better if we extracted this loop code out where we display each user's name into a partial view file. This partial view will be used specifically for displaying users. That way, when we implement our Ajax code, all we need the server to do is return back this partial with the search results, and we can then update this unordered list with the response. So let's cut this loop out and replace it with @include, and this will include a view file into our current view file for us. So we're going to include the partial view from the users folder, and the partial view file will be named users as well. Now we just need to create this users partial view. So under views, users, let's create a new file. I'll save this as users.blade.php, and then we'll just paste in our loop code that we cut out from before. I'll just fix up the indentation here a bit. There we go. And now make sure to save all of your files. I forgot to save my index view file. And now we should have a working user search app, with no Ajax of course. So let's give it a try. Make sure that your server is still running. And I've already got my app up here in the browser. So we can go to localhost port 8888. And here's our app. We have our heading, our search form, and our list of users. Let's try searching our users. So I'll just enter in a partial name, just the letters AN, submit the form, and great, you can see we get back Andrew Perkins and Andrea Vole. And then if I type in just Andrew and submit the form, we get back just Andrew. All right, so our user search app is working great, doing just normal post requests, but it does look kind of bland. So let's now add in some CSS to make it look a little more attractive. Let's switch back into our text editor, and we first need to create a link to a CSS file in our main layout file. So let's go back into main.blade.php, and up here in the head, right after the title, let's create a link. So this is just linking in a style sheet, and this will be inside of a CSS folder, and the file will be named main.css. So just like when we copied our JavaScript files into the public folder, that's where our CSS will go as well. So down here in the public folder, let's create a new folder named CSS. And inside of that folder, we'll create a new file. I'll save this as main.css. And now I'm just going to paste in some really simple CSS, and I'll explain it as we go along. So first we have just a basic margin and padding reset. I just set the margin and padding to 0. Then we have our body styling. I just set the background color to a bluish green color. Then we have our container div styling. For this, I just set the width of the container to 500 pixels, and I center it on the page. Then we have the styling for our content div. Here I'm just giving it a white background color. We add a little bit of margin and padding to give it some space. Then I add this border here with a darker blue color just to pop it off of our background color. Then I round the corners using border radius, both for Mozilla and WebKit browsers. And lastly, I change the text color to this light black color. Then we have some styling for our H1 heading. So for this, I'm just setting the color to use that bluish green color from our background color. Then I just set the font size, I align it in the center, I give it a little bit of margin on the bottom to push the content that's below it away from the heading. And lastly, I give it a border on the bottom with that same color that we're using on the background, that bluish green color. Then we have some styling for our form. I start by just changing the font size, adding a little bit of margin on the bottom, and then changing the color of the text. And these styles will mostly just affect the label that's inside of our form. After the form, we have some styles for our text input form field. So you can see I'm just making the width a little bigger so that it stretches across the page better. We give it a little bit of padding, and we change its font size so that the text inside of the input will be bigger as well. After the text input form field, we then add some styling for our submit button. So you can see I'm just giving it a border here, setting its background color to that bluish green background color that we used before. Then I just change the text of the button's color to be white. We up the font size a bit, and we make the button a little bigger by setting the width and height. And then lastly, we have our styles for the unordered list of users. Here we're just upping the font size and then indenting the list a bit on the left by setting margin left. And that's it for our styling. Make sure to save your file. And so we have it linked in here on our main layout file. Oh, I just noticed we should actually have a / here at the start of CSS, otherwise it won't link to it properly. So make sure it's /css/main.css. That should be correct. All right, save your file, and let's go take a look at our finished application. We'll switch back into our browser. We'll refresh the page, and there we go. That looks much better. So let's try searching for a user. We'll type in AN, and we get back Andrea and Andrew. Let's try searching just Andrea, and there we go. Our application's working good. So that's it for our server-side PHP code, HTML, and CSS for our user's search app. Next up, we'll complete the entire application by adding in the Ajax. I'll see you there. Now that our server-side code for our Ajax user's search app is complete, let's finish up the application by adding in the actual Ajax, so that when we search our users, the page doesn't have to do the refresh. Instead, we just update this list of users with the return search results. The first thing we'll want to do is link in our JSON parser and our Ajax library into our main layout file. So let's switch into our text editor, and under App, Views, Layouts, let's open up our main layout. Now I've already got this opening script tag in here from when I created my HTML markup. So let's link in our JSON parser first. That's in the JS folder, and it's json2.js. And now I'm just going to duplicate this line 2 more times. And for the middle one, we'll load in our tutsplus.js file, our Ajax library. And we're also going to need to create a main.js file, which will act as our application's main JavaScript file. So let's link that in as well. So that'll be main.js. All right, let's now create this main.js file. We'll save our main layout. And under public JS, let's create a new file. We'll save this as main.js. And now let's start by creating our self-invoking anonymous function. There we go. And just to make sure that it's all working properly, I'll just alert out a message here saying working. Let's save our file. Let's go into our browser, and we'll refresh the page. We'll hit resend. And we get our alert saying working. Let's make sure it works when we search as well. I'll search for George. And great, we get our alert. All right, so let's switch back into our text editor, and I'll get rid of this alert statement. So we're first going to need a reference to our form so that we know when the form's submitted, and then we can fire off the Ajax request. Let's create a variable named form. We'll use document.getElementsByTagName. And we'll grab all of the form tags. We only have one, so we just need the one at index position 0. And now let's set the form's onSubmit event handler. We use form.onSubmit. We set this equal to a function. And then remember, at the bottom of our event handler, we need to make sure to return false to disable the form's default action. Now we need to create a few variables to be used in our Ajax method call. First, we need the URL that our form's going to submit to so that we can tell our Ajax method where to send the request. we can again grab this from our form's action attribute. So I'll create a new variable named URL. We can use form.getAttribute and grab the form's action attribute. Next, we'll need the name that's being searched for. We can grab that from our name form field, and Laravel automatically gives it an ID of name, so that'll make it easy to get a reference to it. Let's create a new variable named name. We can then use document.getElementById, and we can grab our name form field by using the name ID and grab its value using .value. Now, since we're using Laravel's CSRF token and its CSRF before filter, anytime our forms do a post request, our application requires that that token be submitted along with any other data when we send the Ajax request. So we need to make sure that the CSRF token is sent with the name that we're searching. Let's create a new variable. I'll name it _token. And we can use document.getElementsByTagName. We'll grab all of the input fields, and we only need the first one, which is our CSRF token, so that's at index 0, and then we want to grab its value. Now lastly, we're also going to need access to the actual unordered list element so that in our before callback, we can give the user a notification letting them know that the app is searching while the request loads. And then in our complete callback, we'll use that list reference again to update its contents with the returned server's response, which would be our search results. So let's create a new variable named list. We can use document.getElementsByTagName. We can grab all of the unordered list tags. We only have one, so that's at index position 0. And now we can issue our Ajax request. So we can use our tuts plus object and call its Ajax method. We'll then pass in our URL variable as the URL, and then we'll pass in our object for our Ajax options. Let's set the method to do a post request, and now let's pass in our data object, and we need to give it the name that's being searched for using our name variable from above, and we also need to set the _token using our _token variable from above. Now after our data, we can set our before callback, and inside of here we can use our list. We'll set its inner HTML, and this will just let the user know that the form is searching. So inside of a list item tag, we'll just display the word searching with a couple of dots. Now lastly, we can set our complete callback. And again, inside of here, we can set the list's inner HTML to display the server's response using our response variable. Now what we want our server to return back with is a snippet of HTML containing the search results. But what happens if nothing was found during the search? In that case, we should display a message letting the user know that nothing was found. So right before we set the list's inner HTML, let's use an if statement. We'll check if we have a response. If we do, we update the list's inner HTML with that response. We can then set an else statement, meaning that there was no response. In that case, we'll set the list's inner HTML to be a list item tag, and this will just say nothing found. And that's it for our Ajax code. Now we just need to modify our user's controller's search action to respond to our Ajax request appropriately. So under app, controllers, open up userscontroller.php, and here inside of our post search action, this is where our form submits to and where our Ajax script will post our Ajax request to as well. So it needs to handle both situations. It needs to handle when the form does a regular post request and when we issue our Ajax post request. Now currently our action responds just by displaying the entire index view file along with our layout containing the search results in this user's variable. So let's just see what happens if we try to use our application as is. Make sure all of your files are saved, and let's go into the browser. Let's go to our home page and make sure to refresh just so we know we have the most recent files. And I'm going to open up Firebug, and let's try searching for a user. So let's hit search, and there we go. Our Ajax request worked. Let me close out Firebug here so we can see the page. And so you can see that our response contains the entire layout and the view file along with our search results. So when we updated the list with the response, we get this messed up page doubling effect. And this is exactly why we extracted out our loop where we display our users into that user's partial file. Let's go back into our text editor, and under Views, Users, let's open up that user's partial view. And remember, this partial view only displays the list item with each user's name. This way we can have our controller's search action detect if we're doing an Ajax request, and if so, our action can respond back to our Ajax script with only this partial file. Then when our list is updated, it contains just this list of users from the search results. So let's go back into our user's controller, and in our post search action, this current code is how we want to respond to non-Ajax requests by displaying our index view file, and this will also use our layout and then display the search results. Remember, our index view, if we open that up, uses our layout, but our user's partial does not use the layout. It's just the user data. So let's go back into our controller. So right before this statement where we return our view, let's use an if statement and check if we're doing an Ajax request. We can do that by using Laravel's request class and call its Ajax method. Now this will return true or false if we're doing an Ajax request. Now remember back to when we were improving our Ajax library and we set that X requested with header. If we go to public.js and open up tutsplus.js and scroll down to our Ajax method, you can see that before we send our Ajax request, we set this request header X requested with. And this is how our app will know that we're issuing an Ajax request. All right, let's go back into our controller. Now inside of our if statement, since we know that we're doing an Ajax request, just to simulate a slow server response, I'm going to use that sleep function again and tell it to sleep for 1 second. Again, you don't want to do this on a production application. I'm just doing it here so that we can see our before callback working. Now we need to perform our search just like we do for normal post requests where we use the where method, but this time we only want to display the user's partial view file, not this index view. Remember, the index view uses the entire layout and the partial doesn't. So we can copy this code from below and let's paste it right after our sleep function inside of our if statement. And then we'll just change this to use our user's partial instead of the index view file. And then the rest of the code will just stay the same. So if we're doing an Ajax request, we display our partial with the search results. Otherwise, we know it's a normal request and we should display our index view file, which will use our layout and display the search results like normal. And with that, our Ajax user search app is complete. Let's go into the browser and test it out. So we'll just go back to our home page and refresh to make sure we have the most recent files. And let's type in a name. I'll just put in the letter E and we'll hit search. And great, it now responds appropriately, updating the page with just the search results into our list. Now I noticed that we didn't use our flash method to flash the contents after the page has been updated. So let's go and add that in. We'll switch back into our text editor. Let's go inside of our main.js file. Now after our if statement, regardless of whether or not we had a response, because either way we're updating that list with some new content, let's flash that list element so that the user knows that the list has been updated. We can use our tuts+ object, call our flash method, and pass in our list to it. All right, let's go give this a try again. We'll go back into the browser. Let's refresh the page. Let's try submitting our search form. And perfect, we have our flash. So we've reached the end of the course. Hopefully you found this helpful in learning how to work with Ajax by seeing the process of creating your own Ajax library, improving upon the code, overcoming caching and browser issues, and then finally using it to build a simple hands-on application. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments. I'll be glad to help as soon as I can. So thank you for watching, and goodbye.